Hello and welcome to the CEC Report for the 3rd of October 2014. I'm Richard Bardon and joining me today is CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks Richard, and welcome to the first CEC Report.
Thank you. So on today's report, BRICS and friends at the UN, yes to development, no to Obama's permanent war, and youth are the future, just don't tell Christopher Pyne. So firstly, BRICS and friends at the UN. Yes to development, no to Obama's permanent war. Now, Craig, at last week's United Nations General Assembly meeting in New York City, the BRICS nations and their allies used the UN for what it was actually created to do.
Yeah, it's rather stunning, Richard. I mean, here you have the BRICS nations, and they're for the viewers who don't know. This is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America. South Africa, but with a lot of South American countries as friends of the BRICS, particularly Argentina. So here you have, this is stunning. I've never seen this in my lifetime. You actually have a discussion going on in the UN about real economic development, and I think that's really got up Obama's nose from what sort of reports that are coming from him.
Yeah. Now, for those who haven't been keeping track of Obama's movements, not that I'd blame you, but he made a very cringeworthy speech at the assembly. He was chairing the meeting. It was at the headquarters in New York. And I'd like to read a few quotes just to give people the flavour of the kind of thing that he was carrying on about. So he says, first of all of us, big nations and small, must meet our responsibilities to observe and enforce international norms. He said, we gain more from cooperation than conquest. And then he went on to accuse Russia of basically invading Ukraine and attacking them, and accused Russia of keeping the investigation, suppressing the investigation of MH17, which of course is completely counter to the truth. It was a Ukrainian army that forced the investigators away. The so-called separatists cooperated with the authorities. They handed the black box to the Malaysian authorities, who then unfortunately gave it to the British, and so we haven't heard anything. But he says things like, America and our allies will support the people of Ukraine to develop their democracy and economy. And then on the terrorist threat, he says the terrorist group known as ISIL must be degraded and ultimately destroyed. No argument there. However, he also claimed at this meeting, said that they were going to do this through training and equipping forces fighting these terrorists on the ground. He says, together with our partners, America is training and equipping the Syrian opposition to be a counterweight to the terrorists of ISIL and the brutality of the Assad regime.
So the problem we got here with this speech of Obama is the context in which it's taking place, Richard, because words mean nothing coming from Obama. In fact, they might sound good on the surface to anyone who just tunes in briefly, but the fact is it comes in a context. Now, what we're talking about is a context of what you've seen was what was brought into the Middle East by Tony Blair, this idea of responsibility to protect. Now, this overturns the pre-existing norm of what we used to call the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia, which is the principle of nations acting in the interests of not just themselves, but the interests of their neighbours at the same time, right? The advantage of the other. So what you have is Obama speaking with a forked tongue. But what you see, and why you can see that he's speaking with a forked tongue, is because of what the BRICS countries are doing. They're actually acting in this spirit of the Treaty of Westphalia, the spirit of cooperation and the advantage of the other. So the reason this is becoming a real threat to the British Empire is because the entire system, financial monetary system, as we've talked about many times on this program, is in the process of disintegration. And you have a counterposition now with these BRICS nations developing this program of development through the highest courts in the world, like the United Nations, which is terrifying the British and the British puppets like Obama. So whilst he says stuff like that, we know now he's arming the very forces that are going to come back to bite us in the future.
And also this took place, remember, after it had been revealed that the so-called moderates, who have got the US backing, they're the ones who kidnapped these journalists, as we've covered here before, and sold them to ISIS, and they were then apparently beheaded live on television.
Well, there's questions about that, of course, because the question is who benefits from all of this, and the issue of a global police state, with global terrorism laws coming in and all these sorts of issues is very much on the table. You just see what's taking place here in Australia now with the degree of terror that is being whipped up amongst particularly the Muslim community is astounding. But it's not something that we haven't warned about. This is not something that is not in the interest of the British Empire and the financiers in order to control the population in the case of a global financial disintegration. Now, I really do find it interesting, though, coming back to your point about the United Nations actually being used as a forum for what it was created for or intended for by Franklin Roosevelt, is because this is the new paradigm. And I really don't think that through the Australian media, people understand that there is this incredibly beautiful, optimistic paradigm taking place in the world amongst these BRICS nations. And we've covered it briefly on the CEC report before about the massive economic development programs that for example, Egypt is taking on. The building of a second Suez Canal. Do you know that they intend to have that thing built by next year? Yeah. Excavated? Yeah. Millions and millions of cubic metres of dirt are coming out of that canal every single week.
And in fact, the dredging on the old canal they've said they've moved 200,000 cubic metres of material with the dredges within the first couple of weeks of operation.
But I think really the highest issue here, Richard, when you look at this fight going on in the United Nations between the Obama British Empire forces and the BRICS countries, is the issue of national sovereignty.
Yeah, and thankfully, Craig, we're not the only ones who saw through Obama's, as you said, forked tongue operations. Now, I'd like to somebody that people in Australia might not be too well aware of, a man named Evo Morales, who's the president of Bolivia. Now, he, along with President Fernandez de Kirchner of Argentina, condemned Obama immediately for his hypocrisy in this speech. Morales in particular was very scathing. He said, quote, "War against war is not the same as peace. That is a perverse formula." He says, "We must solve the structural causes of war: marginality, poverty, the absence of opportunities, cultural, political and social deportations, territorial usurpation and plundering, and so and so." And he also said, "Every year we hear from Mr. Obama his speech of war, of arrogance and threats to the people of the world. And this too is a speech of extremist fanaticism." He said, "This is the century of peace, but peace with sovereignty, with freedom of peoples and not the free market." And that's a pretty good summary of this new paradigm that we've been talking about.
This is the spirit of the BRICS. This is the spirit of countries wanting to express their national sovereignty. This is the spirit that is going to take and save the world if it's allowed to develop and flourish. But again, we risk global thermonuclear war because of what's being pushed by the British Empire through its, through the British Empire, through its, countries like Britain, Australia, and the US under Obama's presidency, pushing the world more and more towards war against war, as the Bolivian president said,
and also pushing these supposed political movements which are ostensibly in favour of democracy, as we saw in Ukraine, where this student protest was very quickly taken over by these radical nationalists, as they're known, the right sector and Svoboda, that we've talked about before. And I'd just like to draw people's attention to a similar operation or what seems to be a similar operation that's happening right now in Hong Kong. Now, this is a breaking development, so we don't have a lot of intelligence on this, but it's got Project Democracy's hoof prints all over it, Craig, and it's typical of, again, like in Ukraine, students protesting. Yes, they have legitimate grievances and students will protest, and good on them, but very, very quickly you see engineered provocations, escalations announced in the dead of night by people who weren't part of the original movement, In this case, one of the main players now is this man called Jimmy Lai, who's a billionaire businessman and a close associate of Paul Wolfowitz, who people might remember as one of the foremost Cheneyaks, as they were called, going back to the original war on terror, the original incursion into Iraq.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think here in particular, this is a development against the BRICS nations.
Mm. Yeah, they're attempting to disrupt.
Just like Ukraine's been used as an attack dog against Russia, so the people of Hong Kong are being whipped up by these project democracy types, the same types that have developed the orange and coloured revolutions, and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine and other coloured revolutions around the world. They're being paid, whipped up, in order to destroy any movements towards sovereignty at all. And of course, Hong Kong used to be a British colony for many, many, many years.
About 150 years.
About 150 years. So it's got a lot of British stooges in there that can be used to whip up the population against the Chinese government. Mm. But Richard, this is the Chinese government we're talking about here. So they're not going to tolerate this. And I also would suggest that they're not going to play into the same asymmetric warfare provocations that other countries that have been witnessed by other countries.
Yeah, and we can probably put a graphic up on the screen here of some of these protests. When we talk about the British influence in this, it's not that hard to see, is it? I mean,
no.
This is these people are waving the British colonial flag of Hong Kong in their supposed democracy protest. Now, how much democracy did Hong Kong ever have under the British rule?
Well, not much. It was conquered through opium, wasn't it?
Exactly. So we'll leave that there. Obviously, we'll report more on this as more information comes to hand, but we'll take a break now, and when we come back, we will talk about the potential for the world's youth to contribute to these great developments that the BRICS countries are engineering. Welcome back to the CEC Report. So, youth are the future. Just don't tell that to Christopher Pyne. Now, Craig, on the weekend there was a panel discussion, the ABC's Q&A discussion, where one of the guests was Christopher Pyne, the Education Minister. Mm-hmm. And what I'd like to do for the viewers is to contrast the perspective that the Australian government is taking on youth and education and development, contrast that with what the BRICS countries and their associated nations are actually doing. So I'd like to cite two examples particularly. Now, Narendra Modi, the new Prime Minister of India, is a really breath of fresh air in world politics, and he's very much oriented to the development of India's youth. He says that that the 21st century will be India's century. India will be the workforce of the world, and a lot of people might not realise how big India is and how young their population is. Craig, there's actually 800 million out of the 1.25 billion people in India who are under the age of 35 years.
Really?
Yeah.
And we're 23 million people here in Australia. That's unfathomable. I mean, how do you measure that?
Yeah.
Wow.
And Modi, well, he was elected on the strength of his commitment to developing the potential, the creative potential, in exactly those terms of India's youth. And what would have come as a stunning break for many people with the accepted line, the politically correct line of overpopulation and limited resources and austerity that we're hearing from the mainstream, as it's called. It's just a complete contrast. Modi says that India's 1.25 billion people are a gift from God. The more people there are, the more wealth you have. Mm-hmm. Because each of those people, if they're educated, if their creative capacities are fostered instead of suppressed, then they have the potential to be the next great scientist, the next great statesman.
Well, so that when you said 800 million people just a minute ago, I mean, that really struck me. Think about the capacity. Each of those individuals, that's not 800 million people as a mass, like some sort of conglomeration. That's 800 million sovereign minds, sovereign creative minds that have the capacity to develop and make discoveries of new physical principles, Richard, of how this universe works, in order to further mankind. And that means make the discoveries of the principles that we don't even understand. Now, go back 150 years. There was no electricity, no reticulated gas, no motor cars, right? There was no paved streets much. It was horse and cart. And I think about my grandmother who died at 107. She was born in 1899. And I thought about all the developments from 1899 to the time she died in 2006 in that 100-year period. What does it mean for the next 100 years if you unleash the actual creative potentials of those 800 million people? And that's just in India. We've got our own youth in this country. We've got millions, possibly billions of young people under the age of 35 on this planet that have the potential of making these sorts of discoveries, of these creative breakthroughs, if they're given a chance.
Yeah.
So this is the principle of Prometheus, the principle of Prometheus that Lyndon LaRouche talks about a lot. This idea of fire, this idea of creativity, of giving mankind the ability to break out of the oligarchical chains. We talk about the British Empire a lot. Empires want to treat people as human cattle.
Yeah, as serfs.
As serfs, as chattel slaves for a so-called oligarchy, or an elite few that have the right to treat people like basically human cattle. That's the view that up until the recent breakthroughs and the paradigm shift with the BRICS countries has been the prevailing view of the world. So this is pretty exciting. When you see Mr. Modri speak and a number of these other BRICS leaders speak, what they're saying, this is the expression of sovereignty and future for the rest of mankind. And Australia is being left in the dirt.
Yeah, definitely. And by intention. And as we'll see, as we'll cover later, Australia's our paradigm is just complete reverse of this, complete reverse of what Modi is talking about, the real wealth being the potential of the minds of his youth, of what President al-Sisi of Egypt says, he considers all of the youth of Egypt to be his children. They're forming new councils of government over there where it's mandated that 50% of them be from the youth generation to be educated in how to run and develop a nation. And the Chinese with their science driver program, what do we have that in any way compares to that?
Well, we have the youth, and you have us, and we're the only organisation that talks about this.
Exactly
right. But
right.
It should be the focal point of every political organisation in terms of what are we doing for the future of our youth in this country. How are we providing the large-scale infrastructure development projects and cutting-edge technologies, whether it be space or magnetic levitation trains, or the development of hydroelectricity, power stations, or whatever. The point is, what are we doing? We're doing nothing. We're selling it all off to the financiers and kowtowing down to the international financial monetary system that we're indebted to.
Exactly. So we'll take a break there, and when we come back, we're going to look at what's happening or not happening, but what could happen in Australia. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing the fact that youth are the future, but we probably shouldn't mention that to Christopher Pyne. Now, Education Minister Pyne appeared on the Q&A program last weekend on ABC television, and he was peppered with questions from the panel, from the audience, about the crisis in education in Australia. The fact that, apparently according to the government's own figures, 30% of graduates won't even have a job once they graduate. The government wants to increase the fees, increase the interest rate paid on HECS debts, all of these things to save money, and by doing so they're completely undercutting the future of the nation, as we've been discussing. So
everything's brought down to the bottom line of money. And that's the problem, Richard, because look, it's like the government's just an extended boardroom of the banks and the financial system.
Essentially.
Right, so they measure everything in terms of dollar capacities. And of course, when Mr. Abbott was asked about this, he talked about their value for taxpayer dollars.
He actually said that because just in case people hadn't heard, there's a Senate Committee on Human Rights that actually found that these cuts, on the basis of youth, were against the Anti-Discrimination Act, but also that withholding welfare payments from people for 6 months constitutes a breach of international human rights obligations. And Mr. Abbott's reply was that he supports the rights of taxpayers not to have their money abused.
Yeah, so like I said, it's like the government's in an extended boardroom with the large banks, right, or the banking system per se. But look, I mean, he talks, I know Christopher Pyne was quoting things like youth unemployment being 12%. That's crap. It's wrong. Look, it's more like 25, 27, 30% in most areas, most rural areas in particular. There is no opportunities for young people to get jobs.
No. And the ones who are employed in the cities, far too many are employed doing jobs that they're well overqualified for, like flipping burgers, making coffee.
And the question is inspiration for young people. Well, it was for me when I was much younger. I said, what are you going to do with your life? How are you going to develop yourself, right? You don't make the assumption that, every person is a dole bludger or every person is, trying to have it easy. People have to confront that issue of what are they going to do with their life. And it's the role of the government, not some boardroom satrapy of the big financial monetary system. The role of the government is to promote the idea of the general welfare, the development of the nation as a whole. That's what you see with the BRICS nations, with the development of, say, Egypt with the Suez Canal, where he said, everyone who's unemployed's got a job, come and join this program. Right, it was coordinated through the military engineers of that particular country. What is Australia doing? Why aren't we developing our country with high-speed rail? We need a high-speed rail system to go from Melbourne to Darwin, back down to Perth, across Nullarbor back to Melbourne. We need that. That can be done. We've got the steel. We've got the capability.
And it's an available technology. It's existed for 20 years.
And that's right. So we can do that. We need to have increased water flows. We can do that through nuclear desalination, or we can redivert rivers from up north. We've done this with our development projects. Right, we need to deal with issues of soil desalination, getting rid of the salinity in the soil. We've got enormous raft of projects, Richard. High-speed shipping, we're an island nation, right? There's enormous numbers of things that we can do, but we haven't got the leadership in power at the moment in order to be able to direct the country just like Modi or El-Sisi are doing in Egypt. What we've got is a boardroom extension of satrapies for the big bankings, the international banking system centred in the City of London and Wall Street. And this is what people really have to realise, that the only alternative to this is what we represent as a political movement. We have to join with the BRICS countries. We have to get on board and work as a collaborative partner with China, not be seen as some sort of hostile country towards them.
Hostile presence in the
Right.
hanging around their neighbourhood.
Because this operation taking place in Hong Kong right now, right, is a very dangerous development, but something that Australia could play a role in actually just saying, look, you cut this out.
Defusing it.
Diffusing it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's many things that Australia can do, and we're not doing it. And look, everything you hear from a lot of likes of Christopher Pyne is premised on this idea of being a satrapy of the global financial monetary system.
Yeah. And none of the justifications hold up at all, because as we've discussed, the real wealth is the potential of people, is the potential of a human mind to create the conditions for its own future.
Yeah.
So that's all we've got time for. We'll leave it there and tune in next week for more.